My name's Charlie Bell. I'm a priest in the Diocese of Southwark in South London, and I spend my day job being a psychiatrist down at the Maudsley and at King's College Hospital. So this book takes the idea of the communion of saints, a doctrine that the Church has talked about for many, many years, and indeed is found even in the creeds of the Church, and also the idea of total pain, something that was developed by Dame Cicely Saunders, amongst others, who was one of the great founders of the hospice movement, and tries to ask, well, what does our doctrine that we talk about and that we say we believe, what does that say to this experience of total pain that people in despair or coming towards their end of their lives might be feeling? And how do those things work together? How do those things build each other up? And what kind of tensions are there between them? I suppose the journey towards this really was originally my work in physical medicine, when I was working with the dying, particularly with cancer patients. And it's always been an interest of mine and a clinical interest of mine to try and work out how best to treat patients in palliative care situations. And then the more and more I thought about those patients, the more and more I thought probably the Church had quite a lot to say to them, but also the Church had quite a lot to hear from them and to listen to them about. And so this book really came out of an interest that I had in what we were saying we were and believed as the Church, and what I was experiencing day to day in the treatment of patients. I think the communion of saints as a doctrine is one which has been at the forefront of many a church argument, many a church debate. In the Reformation, there were all kinds of arguments about whether or not we should be praying to saints, or asking rather for the prayers of saints who had died. And so I think in many ways, as people in the church, and particularly as a Church of England priest, sometimes we've shied away from those doctrines which we felt a bit more uncomfortable about. For me, the communion of saints is really important. It's quite simple. It just means that the Church doesn't end at death, and that the Church continues before we arrive on the earth and after we arrive on the earth, and that all of that is wrapped up in something much, much bigger than that thing that we see and call the Church in our day-to-day lives, and that's the communion of saints. I think as somebody who has a foot in both the camp of medicine and the camp of theology, or of being a priest, I find it hard to separate those two things, doctrine and experience. And I think we've really, as a church, got to be clear and confident in the doctrines that we're talking about and that we say we believe. But we've got to be clear and confident about them because they really relate to real life. So for me, it's really important to bring doctrine into experience and into day-to-day practice, and in my context, into pastoral and medical practice, and to say, okay, what do we know about pastoral practice that might influence what we know about doctrine, and what do we know about doctrine that we might know about pastoral practice? How do those things interact with one another? And I think we need to do theology about reality, and not theology about it, and not an abstract theology that we wish the world existed and that we were applying our theology to. It's got to be grounded in who we are and what we do as human beings, not just as abstract entities. I hope this book in many ways is challenging. I hope it challenges how we relate doctrine to our lived out experience and our pastoral practice, whether that's those of us who are ordained, those of us doing ministry in a more formal way, or indeed those who are in medicine or healthcare. I hope it challenges them a little bit as well to think about what the Christian faith might add to the understanding of the human person. So I hope in a sense it's a challenge, but I also hope it builds people up. I hope it shows that our doctrine still matters, that these things which we proclaimed and professed for years and years as a church still matters, is still utterly relevant to our lives in the world today. It's just that we need to be really intentional about holding both of those things, doctrine and life, up to one another and seeing what kind of light one casts on the other. Of course, that phrase, the communion of saints, can be a phrase which seems to cast some kind of ideal on the church, that kind of almost pretends that everyone in the church is somehow, wonderful and excellent and that nothing can ever go wrong. And that's, in a sense, I think, why we've developed this idea of sainthood in such a sanitized way. We almost think of saints as people that can do no wrong. But actually, if you look through the history of even those that the church calls saints, there's often more than one thing about them, which makes you think, gosh, they're really very, very human, as well as very, very godly. And I think what we're called to as Christians, and certainly what the doctrine tells us we're called to, is that each of us is created in the image and likeness of God. Each of us is called into the church. Each of us is called into something that is so much greater than we are ourselves. Part of that is the word communion, communing with one another, being part of something beyond ourselves, but also the sainthood, being called by Christ. Christ does the godliness. Christ makes us more and more holy. And even if on the surface we don't seem so great so much of the time, and the church doesn't seem so great so much of the time, that's not the end of it. Christ gets the last word. I'm a psychiatrist, so a lot of my time is spent with people who lots of other people would never meet, particularly people who sometimes have done things which other people would look down on or would be scared of or would hope would never happen to them. For me, if we have a theology that's unable to respond to those people, to people that might make us feel uncomfortable, whether that's because they have mental illness or whatever the reason is that society often pushes people to the edge, I think then our theology has a problem. So for me, every time we meet people that cause tension, cause difficulty with the simplistic answers that we so often want to believe in and create and give to people as theologians, when we meet those people, they make our theology so much better if we sit down and listen to them.